So on shorter production runs, usually the RTV molds, whether it's the PVC or the mold frame, will suffice. But if you're going to do a high volume of production runs and take it to a commercial foundry, they don't like working with RTV. So what you have to do is make what I call hard tooling. Here's two blanks. I'll make up usually a dozen or so of these at a time, but basically you have to size your aluminum, the thickness and the X and Y dimensions to fit your part. These have not been, these are just blanks ready to be used for a future projects. Here's one that was used for making these reproduction handle pulls. And again, it started out just like the two blanks that I showed you. And I went in and milled out a cavity on both halves big enough for the master to sit down inside of. So what you do is, just like the non-wood box, it's a two-step process. You attach your master, set your parting line on this pattern board, and you turn it upside down. Now this is before the epoxy is poured in there. And now so you've got your master in there, and you got all these holes drilled in the back. And the reason for that is once you've got your master in there, you're going to hold this guy at an angle, and you're going to start pouring up here and let it roll down, let the epoxy or the aluminum filled epoxy or the steel filled epoxy, which is a blast, you let the epoxy roll down and dam up, and it keeps rising. As it keeps rising, you just lay it over, and eventually you can fill that entire area in there with the epoxy. So the advantage of the epoxy or the steel filled aluminum in these aluminum blocks is the cycle time is considerably less, because the aluminum will dissipate the heat and the wax will cool down in a lot shorter cycle than the wax will cool in an RTV or a rubber mold. So this one was epoxy. Here's one that instead of using epoxy, what we used was an aluminum filled epoxy. Well, we use epoxy, but instead of being steel filled, this is aluminum filled. Well, this is a little unique one in the fact that this particular hard tooling mold, the part did not have draft all the way around, so we had to put a core, a removable core in here, so that when you shoot your wax, you remove the core, and then you can remove the part, because there's an undercut here that doesn't have draft on it. This stuff here, aluminum filled epoxy, the viscosity is about like cold syrup, but it is pourable, and it sets up, I don't know, I always let it set up overnight before. But again, it's a two-step process. You put your part in there, you pour half of it, take your clay off, and pour the second half. These type molds are held together with socket head cap screws. One of the reasons that I had to go to making this type of mold was I do a lot of waxes instead of doing waxes, which is 150, 155 degree. The plastic injection, this is a plastic injection part. It's a material called epylene. So this guy here, you need, it injects at about 350 degrees, which is a little too hot for your RTV. Now, here's something I tried out a few months back, and it worked out fairly well. Same process of making the aluminum or the steel filled molds, but instead of pouring aluminum or filled or steel filled epoxy, I poured clear RTV. And I don't know if it's really any reason. The only reason is I had a bunch of these mold frames already cut out and had the cavities, and this particular one would fit this belt buckle. So that's the, instead of having aluminum or steel, it's got RTV. So here's a wax that came out of the mold, and here's a casting, a sterling casting. And then for another mold, I got a bronze casting for a different geometry buckle. Let me see if I can zoom in here. There we go. Now, I don't think I've mentioned it, but this RTV, the wax and the investment casting process, I know I can't see it with the setup I got, but the detail, if you took, before you investment cast this wax, if you put a little oil on your finger and made a imprint on that wax, it would cast into the part. So for you sandcaster guys, if you really want some detail, go to investment casting. Now, one thing on making the PVC molds that we talked about earlier, I didn't mention, instead of using PVC, it's perfectly well to use brass tubing or aluminum tubing. It's just whatever you got laying around. The other thing that I failed to mention, once you pour the RTV into the PVC pipe, and it's the next day you want to get that guy out of here, you pull it out, it doesn't come out quite that easy. And the reason being, there's still some adhesion of the RTV to the sides of the PVC pipe or the brass, aluminum, whatever your tubing's made out of. So what you have to do is get kind of like a butter knife, if I can find it. Of course I can't find it, but anyway, like a butter knife to go down here and start separating the rubber from the side of the pipe frame, and eventually, once you break it loose, it'll just pop right out. Once you get it released the first time, from there on, it's you're set. Okay, let's talk about coring for just a minute. To the left, you have the Wilton miniature bullet vise, and the mold for the body in front of it has a piece of Delrin or ABS synthetic plastic inserted. It was inserted to the model when the mold was poured. The little bunny plane has got a core that's made out of butter board that's been primed and waxed. Probably one of the most complex coring molds I've made is for this Durago saw. It has a combination of pins, brass pins, and the flesh-colored inserts or cores is cellulose acetate. Now, I could have used ABS or Delrin or anything else, but I just happen to have some scrap pieces around. Here, by the way, there's the model, or portion of the model of the Durago, and it's cool when you can shoot the waxes, and the wax, this is actual casting here, and the castings or the waxes come out with all the rectangle core holes and the pins and all. Very, very effective when you can put the cores in ahead of time in the mold. Just about any RTV mold that you make, or any epoxy ones as well, before it can inject or receive the wax, usually you're going to have to vent the mold at least a minimum of one place, or sometimes in multiple places. So as the wax is going into the mold, it has a way to get the air out of the mold. Two ways I do it is one way, probably the easiest and quickest, is you use an X-Acto knife and cut you a V path from the model to the outside of the mold, so that when the air reaches that point, it's going to push air out external to the mold. And basically you just make one cut and make a second cut. You don't want the air vent, or you don't want the vent to be too large. In some cases you can actually get out of the way here. Some cases you can get out of the way, or get away with just cutting a single cut. I'm trying to do a little V here to demonstrate. There we go. So something like that, originating from the low spot, or the spot on the internal mold that's not filling with wax because it's trapping air, you cut from that point out to the outside of the mold. Now, another way to do it is get you a hypodermic needle, and sizes vary. Here's a small one, and what I've done is I've ground the end of the needle square, and then I've gone in with a really fine pointed burr and gone inside the inside of the needle and chamfered it, or you could use a little carbide high-speed steel tool like this. The purpose is to go in and actually put a little chamfer inside of the needle, and you can actually use these guys as carving, so you can go down and cut with them and push it down, and you can actually cut just like a gouge. Or what I typically do is use it as a rubber drill. And what you do is you go in here and push down and just keep turning it, and as you're turning it, push down and push down, and watch what happens at the back side. When it comes through, you've got a little, there's your core sticking out of the needle. So you pull, if you can, you pull that little core of rubber out, pull your needle out, or your drill, if you want to call it that, and now that's a relatively small hole that's been drilled from one side of the rubber to the other. And get you some fine wire off of a guitar string or something like that. If the rubber gets clogged up inside of your drill, you can push it out with this little wire pusher, I guess you would call it. So, but just be advised, you just have, every mold is different. You have to see where it's trapping air and where you need to do a vent to get that air out of the pocket inside of the mold. I have a friend, a miniaturist, that he's one of these guys that can always do something bigger and better than you. So I had a little fun with him a couple years ago. There's my Stanley 45, that's a third scale Stanley 45. So he had seen pictures of it on the net, mentioned something about it. So I took one of these big old dimes, set the 45 up there on top of it, and I sent him a picture, and he thought it was one of these dimes like in the Wilton Vice. But without any reference in the photograph, that kind of blew his mind. He won't know how I made something that small. I never told him any difference. That's the type of guy I am. So the reason I show you that, I want to talk about something real quick here that took me years to discover this, and that is how to enlarge or decrease the size of your mold to get a larger part or a smaller part. Now, it's more applicable on the larger parts because invariably you'll have somebody bring a gun part or a pistol part or whatever. They say, hey, can you make me one of these? I said, yeah, I can reproduce it. I can make an RTV mold. I can shoot waxes and cast it. But by the time you go through all those steps, it's going to be too small. Oh, that don't matter. It won't matter that much. Well, it always does. They get the part and say, well, this is too small. So anyway, what you can do in those situations is when you make and you're done with your RTV mold, take that mold, fill your shoebox, a little bit above the height of the mold, and soak both parts of that RTV mold in this naphtha. Typically, you got to leave it soak 15, 20 minutes or whatever. And what you do is make sure you've got some kind of reference piece in the mold that you can mic it after you leave it in the solution. It will swell that silicon rubber, that RTV, it will swell it. So you leave it, say, a half hour, you take it out, you dry it off, and then you shoot your wax, and that mold will have grown, but it grows proportionally. So it's a little trial and error, but after a while, you'll realize, hey, if I soak this for 30 minutes, it's going to grow 1.2%. If I do 45, it's going to grow 2%. So it's a trial and error, but the thing that's cool about it, you can end up with a wax that's bigger than the master that the mold was made from. Thus, when you cast it, you can get almost exactly the same size with a little trial and error as your master part. So just put that in your information database, and you might have a need for it one day. The other side of that coin is, if you want to make something smaller, what you do is when you're mixing up your RTV, before you mix it up and pour it, you add some of this stuff here, the naphtha. And then when it's going to take your mold longer to cure than the normal, say, 6 or 8 hours, it might take 2 days. But when it cures, that RTV and rubber is going to be smaller than the master that you made a part from. So you can go either way. There's a couple of videos out there, YouTube, that guys have done on enlarging and shrinking RTV. So a better explanation of it, you might want to check those out. Couple of examples we haven't looked at on different types of mold frames. Here's one that's fabricated out of cast acrylic block. It's in 3 pieces. The center piece being the pattern board. When you put your model in there, clay it up, pour your first part, then you go through the same process. You take it out, you turn it over, and you pour your second half. I've used it a couple of times. It works, but whatever. Lastly, sometimes you might want just an open face pour where you got a small part like an earring or something like that. You put your part in a block. This could be anything. This is some of that phenolic board. You could do it in aluminum or just a piece of old hardwood. Put your piece in there and pour your rubber on top of it. And in these cases here, you're going to rely on getting your wax or your plastic in from an open face pour to get your final product. Just another way to skin the cat when it presents itself. These are somewhat effective when you're using that flubber, the stuff that sets in about 5 minutes. Now, here's a frame that I made a few years back. I've got several of these around here, but they're mirror images. They were cut out of aluminum extruded square tubing. This is a small one, but the thing is, you can set this guy for a small part or bigger part and so forth, and you can also cock it and put your taper associated with the rubber mold. You just have to block off one end, seal it, with wax or clay or whatever when you pour your rubber into this concept here. Here's one I made a bigger one, the same process. You got the 2 mirror imaged frames, which in effect they're adjustable, okay, but this one was made for a rather large part that's made out of a wax that's extremely fragile. But anyway, you get the idea. So with that, we're going to quit talking about mold frames, waxes, and RTVs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the camera in. Oh, no, one last thing while we're at the bench here. There are ways to make castings without making a mold. There's one example. Here's another example. What I did is I took brown sculptor's wax. This stuff is what the sculptors make their master patterns out of. It looks like a piece of beef jerky, but you can dunk it in warm water, or the more you knead it and work the wax, the softer it gets. So what I did on both of these examples here, I mean, to me, that's kind of impressive to be able to do an inlay that tight and that crisp around a curvature. So what you do is you pocket this, CNC, pantograph, or whatever, with a cutter that's got a slight taper to it. So once you get the material pocketed, you take and warm this stuff up, press it down in there to fill the pocket, leave a surplus skin on top of it, rub it with ice cubes to harden the wax, and then blow it out with an air gun, and you take that piece of sculpted wax that came out of that cavity, and you go investment and cast it. I use this technique on some Mosley planes I did years ago, where I was having to inlay sterling silver into the top curvature of the plow plane arms. Pretty effective process. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to put the camera in walk around mode, and I'm going to show you 3 of the wax injectors that I use, and also a heat box that I use to keep the wax at proper temperature for one of the machines. Okay, this is my smallest wax injector. It's got a little pump where you raise the black knob there and push down, and then it squirts the wax out of the nozzle. I've replaced the old manual thermostat and added an electronic control box to keep it better regulated. This is typically the wax that I use when I'm injected in a small injector pot there. This guy here is a commercially made Kerr. You hook an air hose up to it, and it's got a self-releasing spring-loaded nozzle. You push your mold in, and the wax comes out. It's under air pressure, and this air is pushing the wax down. They work, but they don't work as good as I wanted it to. So I had a need for a large wax injector, so we made Big Bertha here. Now, Big Bertha, it's got a 5-inch air cylinder down in the base, 5-inch diameter, and it runs off of air, and down in the lower box there, that's where the air cylinder is, and it's got a set of heating coils in the center portion there, and that door opens up, and inside of that door is a canister like this. It's got a plunger in it with an O-ring, so when you run out of wax, you open the door, take your old canister empty one out, and put this one in, and you're ready to go. One of the big advantages of this unit here, it will shoot the rather large molds, but it runs at a lot lower wax temperature because you have so much power with that 5-inch diameter air cylinder push it against, and when you open the ball valve here, that's what releases the wax out of the nozzle. So let me show you the box. We'll just take a wander down the shop here. There's a plywood box there that's insulated on the inside with aluminum insulation, aluminum foil like you put on the sheeting on the outside of a house. And I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this, but let me see if I can open the box. Inside the box, it will hold 9 canisters, and with the electronic temperature control, there's a light bulb in there that cuts on and off, and it keeps those canisters at a perfect 140 degrees or whatever you set it to. But so you got you a reservoir of canisters for Big Bertha there as you use them up. There's your controller there. So we're going to wrap it up now, guys, and probably later on next week what we'll try to do is we'll actually show pouring an RTV mold, and then the next day we'll inject it with wax. So with that, we'll call it a day, and you guys keep tuned, and we'll see you later.